Good morning. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge that we meet and we learn from each other today on country. I'm coming to you from Gadigal land, where I live, work and write, and I pay my sincere respects to elders past, present and emerging, and I extend that respect to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders who are with us here this morning. Hello, and for those of you who don't know me, my name is Rachel Franks and I'm the Coordinator of Scholarship at the State Library of New South Wales, and I look after our fellows and our visiting scholars, and part of that is coordinating the Scholar Talk series. And today we have one of our visiting scholars presenting for something that's quite different and very exciting. Tess Gardner is a PhD candidate at the Australian National University, and she was until lockdown, but is still working at home on her PhD, which has drawn really heavily on the library's rich Morrison collections. And I'm sure she'll be talking a little bit about that today. But please welcome Tess for her presentation on Australian journalists in China during the 1911 Chinese Revolution. And if you have any questions for Tess, please use the chat feature in Zoom, and I'll be back in a little while to ask those questions. Thanks, Tess.
Okay, thanks very much, Rachel, for that introduction. I'll just get my own slides set up. Thank you all for coming, and thank you to the State Library of New South Wales for having me here. So first, let me begin as well by acknowledging the country that I'm making this presentation from. I'm currently presenting from the lands of the Gadigal and Wangal people. I'd like to pay my respects to their elders past and present, and extend that same respect to any Indigenous people in this space. As Rachel said, my name is Tess Gardner. I'm a PhD student in history at the Australian National University in Canberra, with the National Centre for Biography and the Centre for China and the World. I've been a visiting scholar with the State Library since February last year, and today I'll be talking about the subjects of my research at the State Library, two Australian journalists who were remarkably involved in the changes of Chinese politics in the early 20th century. They were George Ernest Morrison and William Henry Donald. And between them, their careers spanned over 50 years in China. During that time, China experienced the major upheavals that would lead to the creation of the present-day People's Republic. Today, I'll focus on the 1911 Xinhai Revolution, in which Chinese revolutionaries ended the rule of the Qing dynasty and established a republic in China. 1911 is not normally the year that comes to mind when we discuss Chinese revolution, and it has largely been overshadowed by the victory of the Chinese Communist Party nearly 40 years later. The revolution, however, in 1911, ended an empire that had lasted for thousands of years and established the first ever republic in East Asia. Two Australians worked in the background of these huge events, acting as go-betweens and public relations officers in order to place their patrons in power. They provide a really interesting perspective on these events, but their presence in China and their closeness to the political action forces us to rethink the relationship between Australia and China. The response that I receive the most when talking about Morrison and Donald is how strange it is that these two were in China, let alone playing a role in its politics. While the role of Chinese Australian communities has been rightly celebrated in both the work of historians and television shows like Benjamin Law's Waltzing the Dragon, we tend to be less aware of Australians in China. Australia's relationship with China in the early 20th century was also overshadowed by the White Australia policy, but a number of surprising exchanges still took place. Morrison and Donald's presence is also unexpected because it's hard to imagine Australians with the same closeness to the present-day Chinese government, especially given how recently the Australian journalists Bill Birtles and Mike Smith were forced to leave. While their legacy isn't perfect, Morrison and Donald are an example of an Australian engagement with China that was hopeful and open rather than hostile, and one which will remain important to keep in mind. Today, I will show you how Morrison and Donald came to be involved in the revolution and how they transitioned from opinionated journalists to official salaried advisors with the Chinese government. Partly, this was because of their personal connections, their ambitions, and their visions for China's future. Like generations of Western advisors before and after them, they believed that they knew what was best for China and were self-possessed enough to share that belief with their Chinese friends. But their role was also the result of a historical moment in which both the Chinese Empire and the Republic that followed it were weak states beholden to foreign powers like Great Britain, the United States, Russia, Germany, France, and Japan. China was jostled by the competitions of these great powers, but astute Chinese politicians could, on occasion, work this to their advantage. Morrison and Donald became caught up in attempts to bring these powers, especially Great Britain, onto one side or another in Chinese politicians. And today I'll first give a little bit of background on Morrison and Donald, discuss the sources that they've left behind, and then talk about the 1911 revolution and their roles within it. Then I'll describe their careers after the revolution and talk about why these people are worth looking at. So firstly, who were these people? Morrison and Donald's careers were quite similar, although there are a few key differences. Whereas Morrison was the quintessential Victorian adventurer in many ways, most comfortable wearing a pith helmet and conducting amateur ethnography, Donald was much closer to what we would think of as a typical journalist. Morrison was also more senior, a lot more famous, and a lot more well-connected than Donald by the time the revolution broke out. So George Ernest Morrison was born in Geelong, Victoria in 1862. His father, born in Scotland, was the headmaster of Geelong College, which Morrison attended. He established himself as a travel writer with a number of expeditions in between his studies in medicine at Melbourne University after graduating from Geelong College. He idolised the Victorian correspondent and adventurer Henry Morton Stanley, and he hoped to follow in his footsteps, both in adventurous expeditions and journalism. Morrison's career as an adventurer was cut short, however, during an expedition to New Guinea. He shot a New Guinean man and was speared twice in retaliation. This left him unable to walk until he received surgery in Edinburgh, where he also completed his medical studies. Morrison travelled the world for a few years, hoping to find stable work as a doctor, until he found himself broke in Shanghai in 1894. He decided to cross China from Shanghai into the British colony of Burma at the time. And he published an account of the journey, imaginatively titled An Australian in China. He left China filled with praise for its people, who he said afforded him every courtesy on his journey and were always very welcoming. This book established Morrison as an expert on the Far East, despite the fact that he couldn't speak Chinese and knew little about the culture beyond his own observations. Nevertheless, he landed a job as Beijing correspondent for the Times of London in 1897. He established a reputation as a well-informed reporter, frequently scooping other newspapers and the British government's own sources. Part of his success came from the fact that he made contact with a lot of Chinese officials that could keep him informed. His role in the Boxer Rebellion in 1900 also brought him personal fame. Morrison was falsely reported as dead, and the Times published a rather flattering obituary, naming its Beijing correspondent for the first time. Morrison survived to read this obituary and found the whole thing somewhat embarrassing. He was very opinionated and self-assured when he believed that he was right, and this often led to friction with his editors. But he also tended towards modesty and self-deprecation, particularly in his private writing. During the Russo-Japanese War of 1904 and 5, fought largely on Chinese territory, he used his position with the Times to support Japan and put down Russia at every opportunity. By 1911, Morrison was still at the height of his fame as a reporter. Banjo Paterson once dubbed him the uncrowned king of China, and the word of Chinese Morrison carried a lot of weight. He was, however, thinking of leaving and no longer believed that China was as interesting as it once was. Events would soon prove him wrong. William Henry Donald was born in Lithgow, in New South Wales. His dad was a stonemason, but a childhood injury left Donald unable to follow in the family trade. Still insisting that his son learn to work with his hands, Donald's dad found him a job as a printer's apprentice, and he soon went from printing the news, however, to writing it. After a career in Australian journalism, an acquaintance recommended him as editor of the China Mail in Hong Kong in 1903. This was largely on the basis that, at the time, he was a teetotaler, which was apparently quite rare in the Hong Kong press corps. Initially, Donald thought that his job offer was a practical joke, but he readily accepted when he found out it was real, likely out of curiosity more than anything. When he arrived in Hong Kong, Donald quickly became one of the few reporters in the British colony to take an interest in China and cross the lines between the Western and Chinese communities. When he crossed the border into mainland China to interview a Chinese governor, for example, his visit was just as much of a surprise to the British officials as it was to the Chinese governor himself. Donald worked as both an editor and freelance journalist for newspapers such as the Sydney Daily Telegraph and the New York Herald. During the Russo-Japanese War, he earned a reputation as a war correspondent for his coverage of the last naval battle between Japan and Russia. He was the last Briton to see the Russian fleet before it sailed to its defeat at the hands of the Japanese. Donald's talent as a yarn spinner often meant that he inflated this story until he was cleverly sniffing out the fleet, hiding in neutral French territory and causing a diplomatic incident with his investigative reporting. The reality was not nearly as exciting, but such was Donald's ability as a storyteller. Morrison had his own legend and reputation, but myths tended to accumulate around Donald with a lot more frequency. At the start of 1911, he had left the Mail and moved to Xinhai to work as a full-time correspondent. Donald's timing in this was impeccable, and it would put him close to the center of Chinese politics for the rest of his career. Before I go into the revolution itself, I'd like to give some background on the sources that Morrison and Donald left behind, particularly those that you can find at the State Library. By a coincidence that's been very convenient for me, both of these Australians at the heart of the same revolution left material in the same institution. Morrison's papers are much more intact and less scattered than Donald's, which makes discussing his life much easier. And this was Morrison's intention. He died in 1920, and while on his deathbed, he wrote to his wife saying, "I leave to you, to your absolute discretion, all my papers and letters and diaries. These would form the basis of a life of me, should such a life be worth recording. You should carefully go through these, and then, at your discretion, you should present them to the Mitchell Library, Sydney." The Morrison family eventually did just that, leaving a collection that includes the diaries he kept from the age of 16, a wealth of photos and correspondence that depict life in China at the turn of the century, and more personal items such as the medal for gymnastics he won aged 14, a lock of his hair, and the spear fragments removed from his body after his expedition in New Guinea. This was somewhat self-important of Morrison to assume that his papers ought to be deposited in the library, but it's the classic material from which biographies are written and a sort of collection that quote-unquote great men leave behind regularly. Morrison also believed that his papers were an interesting contemporary record of Far Eastern history, intimately written and of value to the historian, which is perhaps a kinder explanation for his donation, and in many ways not wrong. The Morrison papers provide a lot of detail on what he did and thought at the time, which present its own challenges, but is enormously helpful for anybody looking to write a biography on him. Donald, on the other hand, is a much more elusive figure in the archives. He allegedly kept his own diaries and collections of correspondence, but these were destroyed, along with the rest of his belongings, by the Japanese during the Second World War. The papers that survived ended up in the hands of a Chinese businessman in New York, whose descendants won't respond to my emails. The result is, naturally, that his life is more difficult to reconstruct. Researchers on Donald, however, have been aided by the painstaking work of the late Winston Lewis. Lewis was a historian at Macquarie University who became interested in Donald in the late 60s and spent the next 30-odd years tracking down his friends and associates in the hopes of finding their recollections of Donald, or, better yet, anything by him. Lewis was convinced that Donald was an important figure in Australia's relationship with China, one that we needed to pay more attention to, but sadly passed away before he could finish his biography. His wife deposited his research material and notes with the Mitchell, however, and these include copies of papers in the foreign ministries of Britain, the United States, and Japan, photos and correspondence supplied by Donald's friends, and artifacts such as a letter from King George V granting Donald the right to wear a decoration awarded to him by the Japanese, and his membership badge for the Italian Royal Automobile Club. I still have no idea how Lewis acquired that. This provides a lot of detail for which I remain indebted to Lewis, but what is often missing is the reflections of Donald himself. So now that we've looked at Morrison and Donald and the sources they have, let's bring down an empire. Things were not going well for the Qing dynasty in 1911. Originally from Manchuria, the dynasty had ruled over the Chinese Empire since 1644. It claimed to have inherited a tradition of Chinese rule dating back to the second millennium BCE. As the 19th century drew to a close, however, it faced enormous pressure, both from within and without. Externally, the Qing dynasty was the target of the competing imperial powers of the 19th century: Great Britain, France, Russia, Germany, and the rising empire of Japan. While they agreed amongst themselves that China was not worth partitioning, they still extracted treaty ports such as Xinhai, mining and railway concessions, and the right to try their citizens by their own laws rather than China's. This was part of what's known as the Century of Humiliation in Chinese history, and patriotic Chinese were understandably not very happy about it. This fed into the internal threat to the dynasty as well: Republican revolutionaries. The Revolutionary Alliance, or Tongmenghui, were a secret society dedicated to ending the rule of the Qing and replacing it with a Western-style democracy. They were Chinese nationalists who believed that the Manchurian rule of China had been a disaster and had allowed the foreign powers to dominate China. They also advocated for a republic instead of a more competent imperial dynasty, for example, because they believed that it was the most modern and effective system of government in the 20th century. They launched repeated uprisings in southern China around the turn of the century, and they were led by Dr. Sun Yat-sen, an American-trained medical doctor who was known as the father of the nation in China for his role in bringing about the republic. Sun was famous in overseas Chinese communities for his efforts to raise money and support for the Revolutionary Alliance, and was tireless and persistent in his efforts to destroy the Qing. Just before the outbreak of the revolution, he he was touring the United States, raising money for another revolt against the empire. The Qing dynasty responded to the threats to their rule through their own attempts at modernization. They took steps towards a constitutional monarchy, a modern industry, and a modern army. And the last of these brings me to the other key Chinese figure in the revolution, Yuan Shikai. Yuan was a politician and general for the Qing dynasty and was very able at both. In 1895, he was placed in charge of the New Army, a modernized force for the Qing built along Western lines. This army quickly became more loyal to Yuan than the empire, both within the ranks and at the highest levels. He received a lot of good press during the Boxer Rebellion when, as provincial governor, he was one of the few Chinese leaders to suppress the Boxer movement instead of ignoring it, as the Qing had ordered at the time. He was forced into retirement by his political enemies in 1908, but would not stay out of power for long. The Xinhai Revolution itself began on 10th of October 1911, when elements of the new army stationed in the city of Wuchang mutinied and seized the city. This was a spur-of-the-moment uprising that took both the Qing authorities and the Revolutionary Alliance by surprise. Sun Yat-sen, for example, found out about the revolt through an American newspaper. The Qing recalled Yuan Shikai to lead the loyal elements of the new army against the uprising, but he delayed his return so that he could negotiate for more power. In the meantime, more and more provinces began to declare independence from the Qing. In general, the southern provinces were quicker to join the revolutionaries, while the northern provinces were secured by the new army and remained loyal. A brief civil war erupted between the mutineers of the new army and revolutionary volunteers on one side, and the forces still loyal to the Qing on the other. Neither side, however, had the money or forces to keep fighting for very long. For the journalists Morrison and Donald, this was the biggest story to come their way in a long time. In Beijing, Morrison was professionally in his element, although he was distracted by events in his personal life. The foreign editor of the Times, Dudley Brown, exulted in the fact that he had, quote, left every other paper standing. You must feel like old times again, writing telegrams that are the news of the day, he wrote. It speaks to Morrison's talent as a journalist that he received this kind of praise when his greatest concern was not the revolution, but the fact that a woman he had been courting named Bessie had left Beijing. I simply cannot do any work now that Bessie has left me, he complained in his diary. I cannot escape. I think of her all day and all night. Between bouts of pining for Bessie, Morrison was frequently visited by Qing officials sympathetic to the revolutionaries. Some of these visitors were Morrison's sources in the government. Others called upon him because of his reputation. Morrison listened and provided advice to these Republican sympathizers, but his chief hope was that the situation would end soon without bloodshed and that Yuan Shikai may be given powers to come to terms with the revolutionaries. One of Morrison's frequent visitors was Admiral Tsai Ting-kan, an American-educated protege of Yuan. Tsai was loyal to Yuan, but also secretly believed that a republic was the future of China. He would soon provide Morrison an opportunity to intervene in the revolution along those lines. For Donald, the timing of the revolution could not have been better. He had moved to Shanghai less than a year before the uprising in Wuchang. His wife was not especially happy about the move to an unfamiliar city, as she felt she had just gotten used to life in Hong Kong. But the opportunities in Shanghai were too good to pass up for Donald, and she lost that argument. Donald had also made contact with Charlie Sun, a friend of Sun Yat-sen and a senior member in the Revolutionary Alliance. Sun's children would go on to dominate the Chinese government in the 1930s and 40s, and Donald likely met some of them while they were still quite young. But at the time, his relationship with Sun was mostly helpful for Donald's reporting. When the revolution broke out, Donald was close enough to the fighting to report on events and close enough to the Revolutionary Alliance to allow him access to its leaders. But one of the first things that Donald did at the start of the revolution was visit the British Consul General in Shanghai to try and elicit British support. While His Majesty's government wasn't going to recognize the revolutionaries, this opened up a connection between the Revolutionary Alliance and the British government. Donald also travelled up the Yangtze River to report on the course of the war, particularly the fall of the city of Nanjing to the revolutionaries. Years later, he was fond of telling the story of how he scouted the advance of the Revolutionary Army and organized the artillery that brought down the city gates, practically winning the battle single-handedly. The problem with this story is that Donald's own reporting stated that nobody shelled the city in this battle. Regardless of whether he laid any guns or not, Donald was the only correspondent to witness these battles, and during this time he continued to demonstrate his skills as a war correspondent. Comparing Morrison and Donald at this stage, we have two very different experiences that ultimately came down to Morrison's seniority. Morrison was a well-known figure in the diplomatic and political circles of Beijing. For foreign visitors, he was the man who understood China better than anybody. For Chinese officials, as a foreign correspondent, Morrison could provide insight into the competition between the various imperial powers and what they wanted out of China. Morrison was also a very opinionated person and had been providing unsolicited advice to his contacts in the government as early as 1905. As a result, he was one of the first people to come to mind when officials with Republican sympathies, like Xinhai, wanted advice on how the foreign powers would react to the revolution. Donald, on the other hand, sought out the revolutionaries on his own initiative and tried to make himself useful as best he could. However, he remained much more journalist than advisor at this stage. In December 1911, representatives of the imperial government and the provisional republican government met at a peace conference in Shanghai. While Donald did little more than report on these events, Morrison was sent down to Shanghai with an important mission. Shortly before the conference, Xinhai arranged for Morrison to meet with Yuan Shikai, now Prime Minister for the Qing, with near unlimited power. While Yuan had sent the new army south to fight the revolutionaries and even retook cities such as Wuchang and Nanjing, he had come to the conclusion that the Qing dynasty's time was up. Yuan asked Morrison to meet with the revolutionary negotiators, not to convince them to come to make a deal with the empire, but to support Yuan Shikai as leader of the new China. Yuan even provided his personal train carriage for Morrison, decked out with the height of luxury and a personal cook. Once in Shanghai, he reported on events and helped to lay the groundwork for Yuan's rise to power. He also met Donald, and despite working for opposite sides, the two apparently got on quite well. After the conference, Morrison wrote to his editor with a certain amount of satisfaction. "I think I did a good deal to assist Yuan Shikai. The revolutionary leaders declared to me that Yuan would certainly be appointed first president of the Chinese Republic, and that they were prepared to give that undertaking now in writing." As the fighting of the revolution wound down, Yuan arranged for the Qing emperor, 5 years old when the fighting started, to abdicate, and a new Chinese republic was proclaimed. Yuan, however, was not its first president. The provisional president was Sun Yat-sen, who had only arrived in China at the end of December, having missed most of the fighting. Sun was so synonymous with the Republican cause that the revolutionaries agreed to put Yuan in charge only if Sun could be provisional president. He stepped down in March 1912, but he still had ambitions to lead the country afterwards. Thanks in part to an Australian's backroom dealing, the aftermath of the revolution would be dominated by the rivalry between Yuan and Sun. Yuan was an established imperial official who had made a grab for power when the revolution broke out, but was popular internationally. Sun was a more radical Republican and a nationalist, but whose experience in politics had been in underground revolutionary groups rather than open political campaigning. Both tried to establish themselves as the legitimate rulers of China at home and abroad in the aftermath of 1911. And Morrison and Donald's affiliations during the revolution quickly put them on either side of this rivalry and drew them into these attempts at legitimacy. The aftermath of the revolution could have easily looked very different for Morrison. In May 1912, he was ready to leave China and return to Australia. His health was bad. He felt he was too old to keep up with the complications of Beijing's politics, and he was generally quite miserable. The one bright spark was that he was engaged, not to the woman that he had been pining for during the revolution, but to his secretary, Jenny Robin. Morrison's fantasy, as he planned to leave, was of setting up a cottage in the Victorian countryside, starting a family, and possibly running for Parliament. All of this, however, changed when Tsai, now Yuan's secretary, brought Morrison a new job offer in August, advisor to the president. This was a shock to Morrison, but made perfect sense to Yuan and Tsai. The various foreign powers with interests in China had begun to impose advisors on the Chinese government that they could not particularly rely on. Even if their French political advisor genuinely wanted to help, for example, Yuan could reasonably expect him to provide advice that benefited France more than China. Morrison, on the other hand, had a working knowledge of the international situation and the foreign press, and he had already proved himself to be a dependable agent in the peace conference at the end of the revolution. While they never expected Morrison not to support Britain's interests in China, Yuan and Tsai felt that they could trust him a great deal more than their other advisors. The prospect of advising China excited Morrison enough to put off his semi-retirement. He could shape the future of the country, help it negotiate with the foreign powers, and lead it into modernity. The fact that his salary would be over double what he made as Times correspondent probably didn't hurt either. One of Morrison's first jobs as advisor was to help with the new China's public relations. He traveled to England in the middle of 1912 and, while there, received a favorable reception in the press. Morrison's reputation was so good that his very appointment actually reflected well on Yuan. It was a sign that Yuan Shikai could develop the country and work with the Western powers. The British media imagined Morrison as a patient teacher for Yuan, as you can see in this drawing in the Illustrated London News. Interestingly enough, the original reference for this was actually a photo of Yuan and Tsai Ting-kang, and the artist transplanted Morrison's head quite badly onto Tsai's body, which is why it looks nothing like Morrison. Morrison also took this opportunity to reassure the media that China was in good hands. He claimed that the rivalries between Sun, Yuan, and the other factions of Chinese politics were the healthy disagreement of a new democracy instead of the prelude to a civil war, and that Yuan was strictly adhering to the constitution. He told his former newspaper, The Times, that the chief complaint made against Yuan was that he was too attached to the constitution and the rule of law. Morrison's work with the press helped secure a loan that would stabilize China's finances, as well as bringing private investment into China. This was hugely important as Yuan needed money to disband the revolutionary armies and stabilize China. Any new industry or railroads in China also had to be funded with foreign capital at the time. Morrison's claims of China's stability were absolutely not true. Neither was his presentation of Yuan as anything but a dictator, and he likely knew it, but for the moment, he was willing to ignore any misgivings he might have had about Yuan and support China's reconstruction. This would not last. Just as Morrison fell into Yuan's orbit, Donald fell in with Sun Yat-sen as a result of his friendship with Charlie Sun. The Revolutionary Alliance, likely through Sun, had Donald ghostwrite a manifesto for Sun Yat-sen towards the end of the revolution. Parts of it recalled very Western ideas about freedom and enlightenment, such as when it said, "Oppressed beyond human endurance, we deemed it our inalienable right as our sacred duty to appeal to arms and deliver ourselves." According to some biographies, Donald wrote this with the help of a bottle of bourbon, which might help explain the American influence somewhat. But the manifesto also blamed the state of China at the time on the Manchurian rule, including its closed-off approach to foreign relations. It assured its readers that the new government would respect foreign lives and property and abide by all agreements previously signed by the imperial government. All of this was understandable in a document designed to reassure foreign readers that the revolution was not too much of a threat. After stepping down as president, Sun was put in charge of China's railways. Donald accompanied him as he toured the Chinese train network and developed ambitious plans to connect the nation by rail and develop China. Donald used his position as a journalist to present these in the best possible light in the publications that he worked for, despite privately thinking that they were ridiculous and unworkable. Both Morrison and Donald then were put to work by their employers Yuan and Sun. They used their skills as journalists to try and elicit foreign support for the factions that they served. Like Morrison, Donald also hoped that he would be able to help guide China's future. Like Morrison, however, Donald quickly became disillusioned with his boss. While they were both on opposite sides of the political divide, Morrison and Donald came to bond over their shared frustrations. These are best summed up in a letter that Donald wrote to a friend in the Australian press in 1913. "I see Morrison daily, and he does not know whether to be tired of his job or not. Advice is easy to give, but a horse can be led to a stream, etc. Yuan listened to Morrison's advice, but this did not mean that he necessarily followed it. Donald reflected that as Times correspondent, he had twice the prestige and 3 times the influence, compared to his role as an advisor. This letter found its way into a number of newspapers in Australia, which angered and embarrassed Morrison a great deal. They had become friends by this stage, however, and he did not stay mad for long. Donald, for his part, quickly came to the conclusion that Sun Yat-sen was a fool. He wrote to Morrison shortly before his trip to London in 1912, saying that pseudo-patriot Sun Yat-sen was not the man he was alleged to be, and had no brains to develop anything of a problem by himself. Despite his frustrations, however, Donald still saw Sun as a friend and wanted to help him as much as possible. He remained with Sun until a failed uprising against Yuan forced him to flee to Japan, while Donald remained in China. After the revolution, Morrison and Donald started to work together more and more. They advised a number of different politicians for the rest of their careers, sharing frustrations and occasional victories. During the First World War, they helped convince China's leaders to join the Allies in 1917. Their hope was that China would be able to regain Germany's concessions in China. Morrison died in 1920, shortly after seeing those hopes dashed at the post-war peace conference in Versailles, where the German territory instead went to Japan. Donald, still convinced after his time with Sun on the railroad that China did need to modernize its economy, ran a Bureau of Economic Information for the Beijing government in the 1920s, collecting statistics and publishing information to encourage foreign financiers to invest in China. In 1928, he became an economic advisor to the Manchurian warlord Zhang Xueliang, and a few years later started to work for the leader of nationalist China, Chiang Kai-shek, incidentally, the son-in-law of Donald's old friend, Charlie Soong. As a result, Chiang and his wife treated Donald like a family friend. When Japan invaded China in 1937, Donald wrote pro-Chinese propaganda aimed at the West, hoping to convince the Western powers and his native country of Australia to support China against Japan. While Sun Yat-sen never frustrated Donald enough to leave, Chiang Kai-shek did, and he left China in 1940 tired of the corruption and ineffectiveness of the government that he served. He was, ironically, returning to China via the Philippines when the Japanese invaded as part of the Second World War. Donald was interned and remained in a prison camp in the Philippines until he was liberated. He survived the war, but died shortly after in 1946. I'd like to finish by reflecting on a few themes that come up in a focused biography of Morrison and Donald. The first is how they became advisors. They largely got these jobs as a result of who they knew. Morrison was offered a job by one of his government sources. Donald fell in with a good friend of a revolutionary leader. As journalists, they had skills that were useful to their Chinese employers. They understood the international situation in China, but could also act in what we would now call a public relations role. The only reason that these public relations were important, however, was because the various factions of Chinese politics needed foreign support to succeed. Morrison and Donald's work as advisors was part of Sun and Yuan's attempts to get the foreign media on their side. This was more important to them than getting either advisor's opinion on China's internal affairs, which proved to be fairly disappointing for both Morrison and Donald. In the background of their personal connections and their role as advisors was the imperial presence in China. Not only did it allow them to be there in the first place, it meant that they enjoyed protection from the Chinese legal system and gunboats anchored just off the coast if things ever got too serious. This was an imperial presence that Morrison and Donald largely supported and never saw as being mutually exclusive with their support for China. It's tempting to see Morrison and Donald as a counterpoint to the more xenophobic attitudes that were, and indeed still are, very common in Australia. As Chinese-Australian relations spiral in tit-for-tat exchanges, and Chinese-Australian communities continue to face discrimination, Morrison and Donald provide an example of a more open engagement with China. We need to remain aware that their careers were possible because of the extent of imperialism in China, and that they also shared a belief that they knew what was best, which proved to be untrue and more than a little condescending. Nevertheless, they can still serve as a reminder that the history of Australia and China goes beyond goldfields, Chinatowns, and the White Australia policy. They're a reminder that Australians haven't always been hostile to China and don't always have to be. And that reminder will remain important for as long as Australia wants to have any relationship with China. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Tess. There's so much in that talk today. We do have a couple of questions coming through. So if you do have a question about Morrison or Donald, please pop that in the chat. The first thing that's coming through is a little bit of a biographical practice question for you, and sort of how you will balance as a researcher and then as a writer these two quite enormous personalities and this really incredible context that they are in, and how do you give weight to both of those stories?
Yeah, that certainly has been a challenge, especially because there's so much more Morrison material than there is Donald material. So it's certainly very easy to let Morrison's perspective and the role that he played overshadowed everything. What I've been doing to sort of remain focused is to keep the periodization and the kind of themes in the historical events that I want to discuss in mind, and then fit their role and the sources that I have around that. What I'm doing isn't necessarily a straight up cradle to grave biography. I'm interested in those details and I bring them up where they're relevant. But in some ways, it's more of a political history that looks at how these two Australians were involved.
Because even with secondary material, there is more on Morrison than Donald, I'm guessing.
Yeah, yes, absolutely. So Morrison has, I think, one more biography than Donald. But also, like, Morrison shows up quite a bit more in the work of other historians. That's partly, again, because he left so much material, and a lot of it is actually quite useful to historians looking at things like the Boxer Rebellion or the Xinhai Revolution. So people end up discussing the role that he played quite a little bit more in the work of established histories. Donald is a bit more in the background.
And I suppose it is much easier, although I have seen Morrison's handwriting, but the diaries are obviously quite informative, and you've been drawing a lot on those. Have you made your way through all of them yet?
Not quite all of them. I mean, what I've done is essentially zoom in on the dates that I think are important, because some of the details are perhaps a little bit more mundane than I really need to think about. So some of it is just, complaining about a dinner that he went to and how he didn't like any of the guests there and the food was bad, which is, interesting and funny, but not really relevant to China's politics. And yes, as Rachel Leslie said, like, Morrison did absolutely have doctor's handwriting. That's, a bit more of a physical challenge in working with these sources.
Yeah, someone is commenting in the chat about how it's interesting that Donald's original papers have never been made available. So it does put his story at a slight disadvantage. And somebody else is asking a question which you are under no obligation to have read this already. They're asking if you have any comments on Peter Thompson's Shanghai Fury and that particular account.
Yeah, no, Shanghai Fury is a really interesting source. I think it's a good point to start if you're interested in Australians during this period. Morrison and Donald play a role in Thompson's narrative, as do a whole bunch of other figures like Harold John Timperley, who I'm looking at in my PhD but haven't talked about today, and Frederick Lionel Pratt, who I was originally talking about but has kind of faded to the background of my work. But I think Thompson in general, again, very good starting point, but has a tendency to overinflate the importance and the role that they played. So that's something to be cautious about when reading Shanghai Fury. And also he co-wrote a biography of Morrison that's a little bit more recent with Robert Macklin.
So this is something we were talking about in the green room earlier before we came online. Somebody's asking about the men and if they became fluent in Chinese or if they did rely on translators for all their time in China.
Yeah, so Morrison never learned Chinese. I think he might have attempted to learn, but like many foreigners, he found that quite difficult. And like many British and Australian men, even today in China, could get by without needing to learn. And one of the things that was stipulated in his contract with the Chinese government was that they would pay for a translator to accompany Morrison and help him with all the work that he was doing. With Donald, it's a little bit more interesting because part of his legend was that, like he understood China but never learned the language, and he never ate Chinese food, and he sort of insisted on not going native. There is evidence to suggest that after spending 50 years in China, he had actually learned enough to sort of pick up the gist of a conversation, but that he chose not to let that be known, essentially so that he could sort of remain a little bit more in the background, and so that fewer Chinese people would bother him, I think is the impression I get.
And someone's asking an interesting question about what drew you to Australian journalists in China in the first place. And sometimes your motivation can change while you're doing a PhD, right? But if you could talk a little bit about what first sparked this story for you.
So actually, initially it was in a project I was doing for honours, where I'd sort of been interested in Chinese history throughout undergraduate because I didn't know very much about it. And I was in a travel writing seminar and asked to sort of write about a piece of travel writing. And I think I might have stumbled across the Morrison collection on the State Library's website and learned about an Australian in China, that travel book that he wrote in 1894. And I thought, perfect, I'll write about this. This will be great.
Oh, okay.
And then I just kept on finding more and more material on him. Someone else recommended that I talk to Donald about it, and suddenly I had more material than I know what to do with.
And are you still enjoying working with them? It's sort of, biography is quite a challenge sometimes. It's sort of, I know that different people have different views on whether you need to like your subject or not.
I think it can be healthy to have a little bit of to not hold your subject in too much awe, where you're afraid to criticize them, and especially as you read Morrison's private thoughts, which he might not necessarily have shared to everyone. Not everything he said is particularly agreeable. I remember reading one letter that he sent to a former, I think it was either a former classmate at Geelong College or Edinburgh University. And he was saying, absolutely horrible things about, I think, Welsh and Irish people. And so, I mean, there are always confronting things by these people to read, especially when they weren't always, and they weren't always pleasant in person. So I don't think I necessarily would enjoy spending time with these people. But in some ways that's a benefit, because it means I treat what they do critically.
Someone's asking quite specifically about your paper today. How much do you think Morrison and Donald's advice was actually acted upon versus them being treated as token whites in a political structure? And there's a comment there about how they note that Madame Sung once told Dennis Warner that Donald was not much more than a delivery boy. Ouch.
Yes, that is an interesting quote. Okay, so to start with that first point, I'll talk about Madame Sung in a little bit. I think they did affect some things, but what I hope that I've shown today is that their role was much more in public relations. That was their value to the people who employed them. But that said, there are things that they did make a difference in. So things like involving China in the First World War, that was like a pet project of Morrison since 1915. And that took a lot of concerted political effort, something that they worked quite hard on. And that's definitely where you can track their influence. There's certainly a sort of more heroic narrative, particularly in one of Donald's early biographies, that where, if you read it and believe it, then, Donald was behind everything that happened in 20th century Chinese history. I don't quite go that far. As for Madame Sung's quote that Donald was a little more than a delivery boy, I think that's perhaps unfair. I think there's certainly an essence of a kind of post-war reflection after the fact, and perhaps a sense of bitterness. I'm not entirely sure. I shouldn't speculate too much on what she was thinking. But I think Donald definitely played a role as an economic advisor from the 1920s and 1930s on. That's where he had a definite impact. And something that I touched on a little bit in the talk, but becomes more and more prominent over Donald's life in particular, was his role as an informal ambassador, essentially, particularly when he was advising warlords or governments that the British or American and other foreign governments didn't want to recognize. He knew enough people in their foreign services that he could let them know what Zhang Xueliang was thinking or what Chiang Kai-shek was thinking, outside of the sort of normal channels of communication.
Well, it is certainly a fascinating project, all the little things that brought you to it. I'm sure everybody today is grateful that that all unfolded the way it did, and people are wishing you very well for your PhD and looking forward to what comes next. And I would like to thank Tess very much for her great presentation today. I'd like to thank you all very much for coming. We've had a terrific crowd this morning, a huge number of people tuning in, which is lovely to see. And I hope that you can all join us next time. So the 5th of October at 11 a.m, our next Scholar Talk will be by environmental historian and CH Curry Fellow, Dr. Rebecca Jones. So do tune in for that. She's going to be talking about her work at the library and living with extremes in arid Australia. Until then, please stay safe and stay sane. There's still lots of stuff happening on the library's website, so have a look there if you're wanting a little bit of company in lockdown. And thank you very much for coming. We'll see you next time. Thanks, Tess.
Thank you so much.